Are you a member of the DC Bar? USI Affinity proudly presents the DC Bar Lawyers Professional Liability Insurance Program, meticulously designed to address commonly overlooked coverage gaps and proactively mitigate claims. Enjoy a 5% Bar Association membership credit on your LPL premium for each attorney in your firm who is a DC Bar member. Our exclusive risk management and loss prevention services include access to a wealth of information and guidance on our website, as well as a consultation hotline staffed by loss control experts. Don't let coverage gaps cost you up to $75,000 a year. Let one of our specialists review your policy today. Greatness is in the little things, and LawPay helps ensure every detail is accounted for. Provides secure, flexible payment solutions while reducing administrative overhead and ensuring IOLTA compliance. Plus, with features built specifically for legal professionals, like automated scheduled payments and secure payment card storage, it's no wonder over 50,000 law firms partner with LawPay to go above and beyond. It's easier than ever to streamline your processes, enhance client satisfaction, and increase retention and referrals. Put simply, LawPay helps DC Bar members exceed expectations every time. Learn more by visiting lawpay.com/DCBar. MyCase isn't just an end-to-end practice management solution built specifically for legal professionals. It's a trusted partner chosen by over 15,000 law firms nationwide. Elevate client trust with bank-grade encryption that provides sensitive case information, built-in IOLTA and PCI compliance to ensure all client payments adhere to strict standards, and responsible AI-powered technology that frees up time to focus on client service. Learn more by visiting mycase.com/associations and search for the DC Bar Association.
Welcome to Brief Encounters, a podcast produced by the Washington, D.C. Bar. Thank you everybody for listening. The goal of Brief Encounters is to help connect D.C. Bar members and allow them to hear from good people doing interesting things in our legal community. My name is Patrick Reimherr, and I'm a lawyer with the law firm Ness Feldman, a law firm that specializes in energy and environmental issues, and I serve as the co-chair of the Energy Subcommittee of the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources section of the DC Bar. Perhaps one of the best parts about hosting a DC-based podcast is that it gives you access to interesting and important people in American policy and politics. Our guest today, Zaidi, is a prime example of that. Ali currently serves as Assistant to the President and National Climate Advisor, and as part of that role, Ali leads the White House Climate Policy Office. Ali's a lawyer, which is perhaps a prerequisite to being on Brief Encounters, and he's a respected expert in energy and environmental law and policy. Something I admire about Ali is that he seems just as comfortable writing about complex legal topics to academics as he is speaking at rallies about climate change. I should say that I witnessed this skill firsthand when, as a law student, I had the opportunity to serve as a reviewer for a piece that Ali wrote for the Stanford Law Review Online entitled Mandates for Action, Corporate Governance Meets Climate Change. Ali, welcome to Brief Encounters.
Good to be on with you. Thanks so much.
We're really excited to have you, but I have to admit that I sketched out this interview a few weeks ago, and then over the last few weeks, there were just so many announcements that came out. New regulations, new grant funding. Put simply, there is a lot going on. And I actually think that's probably a good place to start. There's a lot going on, and I personally always kind of wonder how much people really know about it. A poll in August found that 7 in 10 Americans knew little or nothing about the Inflation Reduction Act. Hopefully that's changed since August. But as you reflect on the last few years, months, or even weeks, how would you describe the work of the Biden administration in the energy and environmental space? And what is the story that the Biden administration can tell as it relates to these issues? And what do you think people should know?
Great. Well, thanks for hosting me. It's good to do something with the DC Bar other than mail in my dues every year. It's really remarkable what the president's been able to accomplish over the last 3 years. And one of the 4 remits from him to all of us on his climate team and his environmental team was we weren't going to be successful if we took sort of a single faceted approach to this moment. We were not called upon to be greenhouse gas accountants. We're called upon to meet the moment, which means in equal part tackling climate change, strengthening our economy, addressing longstanding issues of environmental injustice. And we've tried to do that the way my team is structured here at the White House is on a sector by sector basis. So it's not just power policy, it's industrial policy, it's buildings policy, and so on and so forth. And I think that structure and the breadth of the ambition has resulted in a watershed moment for the United States in a way that we probably haven't seen in 40, 50 years in the environmental space. You mentioned the poll, and the thing I'll say about that is there probably aren't a lot of people who know that the Safe Drinking Water Act is the reason we've got PFAS standards, or TSCA is the reason why we've been able to root out asbestos. People don't track bills, but they do track progress, and I think we're making it in leaps and bounds.
So that kind of leads to another question. How do you think most Americans would be experiencing the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act at the moment, or will over the next few years as things continue to get implemented?
Yeah, number one, I think, is going to be a shift to lower cost, more resilient, and cleaner electricity. That's obviously felt for fence line communities in reduced particulates and less mercury raining down from the sky, fewer effluents entering water systems, less risk associated with combustion residuals. And, we talk about cleaning up the grid as if it's some sort of future exercise. But think about this for a second. 2024 will be a year where we add more electricity capacity than we have in 2 decades. So we're building a bunch of stuff. 96% of that new electricity capacity will be clean energy, whether it's solar or wind or geothermal or, frankly, nuclear plants that are coming back to life. This is a game change, I think, in terms of the trajectory of the grid and in terms of the country. Another place where I think people are feeling it right now is the shift to cleaner transportation. And that looks like everything from, the grants we've given out in Arizona to build charging for e-mobility, scooters for 2 and 3 wheelers. That's improving the lives of people in the delivery business. Folks striving to get into the middle class no longer have to breathe in diesel gunk to get from point A to point B. It's a shift in that iconic yellow school bus to electric. Hundreds of school districts now with grants to make that change. And of course, we're seeing it in the American auto sector, where we've gone from basically no battery capacity to 15 gigafactories and counting, 10 million EVs worth of batteries that will be produced by factories here in the United States at the end of this decade, quadrupled the number of sales of EVs, $7,500 on the hood of a new car, 4,000 on the hood of a used car, 13,000 dealerships now signed up to help us administer the 30D and 25E tax credits, and a whole bunch of change taking place in a good way to pull American auto workers off the sidelines and into the race that will define the next chapter of transportation history. So we're seeing it in every sector, but I think those are two places where it's just massive, unavoidable, big time, good news change, cleaner air, and a bunch of dollars being saved by families for decades to come.
Yeah, it does seem like, I think for a long time there was kind of this sense that if you did things that were good for the environment, that you had to do things that were necessarily bad for the economy. And I do think that there's been a shift in that dynamic where I think people are starting to recognize the actual benefits that come economically from making investments like this. Do you credit that, 100% to the Inflation Reduction Act, or do you think the economics were kind of shifting before? Or how do you kind of see it?
It really depends on the sector. So, I think in the power sector, we paved the way for this transition over the last 2 decades, particularly accelerated by the Obama years and the Recovery Act then, 80, 90% cost declines on solar, on wind, on batteries. On the transportation sector, I think the shift has been more significant, and it's one that's been accelerated by not just the Inflation Reduction Act, by the infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Bill, the first round of light duty standards and CAFE standards, the second round, all enshrined in an executive order that the president signed in August 2021. So I think that's driven it there. In other sectors, I think we're really sort of in the early innings, and the president's investment agenda, his regulatory agenda have opened up new avenues of decarbonization. Take, for example, climate smart agriculture, which we sort of launched through executive action at the beginning of the administration and then expanded dramatically as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now we have 80,000 farms, 75 million acres enlisted in climate smart agriculture practices, with line of sight just based on Farm Bill, annual appropriations, and the Inflation Reduction Act to about 250 million acres, or about, a quarter of the farmland in the United States. So that's a game change that I think really has been the president's shoulder to the wheel. Same in the industrial sector, where I think we've gone from maybe not 0 to 60, but 0 to 55 in a very short period of time.
Yeah. The kind of cross-sector impact is definitely being noticed. A related question, and you probably hinted on parts of this, but one of the people I follow closely, Alicia Seiger, often describes climate change as an everything problem, meaning that so many of the things we do, the buildings we build, the commute to work, the food we eat, et cetera, contribute to climate change, and therefore we will necessarily need to think about, lots of solutions, not just one. But obviously some problems are harder than others to solve. Can you identify what you see as kind of the hardest problems to solve, and maybe lay out how the Biden administration's been tackling them, and then maybe if there are kind of future steps in those areas too that we could address? How do you do that?
Yeah, Alicia's such a incisive thinker and just a phenomenal human being. So glad for the shout out to her. I think a few reactions to that. The first is there's a hard nut to crack on call it the electricity system. It's not so much the deployment of solar or necessarily even the licensing of a new reactor. It's coordinating that with the sort of balance of system issues that you need to tackle to get the electricity onto the grid. New rate mechanisms or rate structures for inventive technologies, understanding how to compensate 24/7, maybe in a different way than variable, understanding how to think through the reliability and resilience benefits that come from distributed generation, or even from new transmission lines, which frankly, we don't compensate for. Thinking through interconnection in at least a smarter way, thinking about the role of GETs and advanced reconductoring, and again, how you finance all of that. And then working through that system at a time when you've got a lot more sort of bilateral arrangements going on, and C&I playing a very different role as you shift more load on a sort of ETU level to electricity, and then throw on top of that new load growth from AI. How does that whole system adapt to it? And I think that's a challenging thing. And as you go through it, you realize there are supply chain constraints you didn't even see before in grid parts, in transformers and substations. That's number one, I think, first and foremost. The second, I think, that I struggle with is around construction materials. We're, I think, rapidly trying to proliferate interchangeable, consistent, rigorous approaches to environmental product declarations and understanding embodied carbon, to create the right incentives on the demand side, where municipal governments and the federal government tend to be purchasers in industries like the auto industry, which is the largest purchaser of primary steel. So how do you build in the right incentives? And then how do you harmonize that from a trade policy perspective? The EU obviously moving down the track to implement carbon border adjustment. Here at the White House, we've launched a climate and trade task force led by us here, animating the interagency to take on these issues of data, of transparency, of underwriting, of interacting with other trade policies and regimes overseas. So that's a second one I think that's pretty big and thorny. The third one I just put out there that I think is underattended to in the climate discourse, because the climate discourse tends to be dominated by GHG folks, is the whole sort of resilience and adaptation space, and how you deal with these proliferating multi-vector risks that cascading through the physical economy. And, disclosure and smart business planning is part of it, but there's a lot, again, that wraps into it, including what the insurance market does in the face of all of this. So I mean, look, if you work on climate, you shouldn't be looking for a layup, but it's an exciting time to be in the business.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's interesting. I think that as a person who spends a lot of time thinking about FERC, The first thing you mentioned related to the electricity system being one of the key problems is something I notice a lot. That actually kind of relates to one other question I wanted to ask you, which is, it's very often that it's not just kind of one agency or one level of government that's involved in these decisions. And, as it relates to interconnection, for instance, obviously the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is really involved in that process. And I'm sure you pay very close attention to everything they do. But could you talk a little bit about maybe the difficulty of kind of cross-agency coordination as it relates to some of the things that you've been involved in? And this might also be a good opportunity to give the listeners just a chance to hear a little bit more about your role at the White House.
Yeah, difficulty and joy. So, there are a lot of different types of multi-agency efforts that we have going on, and they're all so essential. So one example, for example, we just issued new rules around the sustainable aviation fuels tax credit earlier this week. That was an exercise my team was very involved in, bringing together technical experts from EPA, USDA, the Department of Energy, and obviously the tax team at the Treasury Department, making sure that we were breathing in a lot of environmental rigor, but also well calibrated to the practical realities of a nascent field that we really want to take flight. So that's part of the kind of coordination we do. Another example is, working on this massive piece of business, the light duty vehicle rules. So making sure that as we construct those rules, that we are integrating the implications of the variety of tax policy, our best information on industrial capacity and capability. And then as we surface questions or issues, chasing those down in the real economy and trying to solve for them. The EV transition is something we've spent a great deal of time on, including bringing utility sector folks in, bringing OEMs into the White House, and making sure there's a really robust dialogue across the handoffs in the EV transition so that things aren't falling through the cracks. But we've got processes like this from everywhere, including super pollutants like methane to nascent and incredibly promising technology areas like hydrogen. Hydrogen's regulated by, a number of agencies, whether it's the sort of safe transportation side of it, or the Clean Air Act side of it, or the 45V tax policy side of it, making sure we're seeing through all of those and everybody's talking to each other. The Climate Policy Office, CPO, my team, tries to build the table to have that conversation.
Do you notice that it's a little harder with kind of the more independent agencies? Are you still able to kind of structure policy in a way that things are aligned?
Yeah, look, there are obvious limitations when we engage with independent agencies. We are in some ways more a stakeholder than anything else in those conversations. We have to be respectful of the limitations. But, we talked to NRC about advanced reactors and their recent efforts to streamline approvals, because that's obviously very interactive with our efforts to get SMRs off the ground. And we certainly talked to Chairman Phillips and his team about the variety of issues that hit his desk, again, in a way that's appropriate and consistent with the rules, but it's a coordination that's necessary. And, it's not just federal independence. We talk to our counterparts around the world. We talk to the Air Resources Board in California, other regulatory bodies. It's important for everybody to stay synced in what is a very fast-moving, fast-paced transition that's taking place.
Yeah, I will say that one of the other kind of legacies of the IRA is the extent to which, it's required DOE and the IRS to coordinate on different aspects of things that is probably, good for creating good policy. And so
yeah,
we don't have a ton of time left, but I wanted to ask you two more questions. The first is, so there's obviously in the background, there's an election happening. And in the event that the administration changes, how do you think about how to ensure progress keeps going? Or do you feel like we're kind of set on a good path?
Leadership Matters in Washington, analysis that's been done that compares the trajectory that the United States is on, thanks to President Biden's leadership, versus the trajectory that if you implemented, for example, the House Republicans' agenda, the delta in 2030 in terms of emissions alone, and I'm not even talking about the competition with China on batteries and so on and so forth and all the other puts and takes, just on emissions alone, would swallow all of the emissions from the continent of Europe and Japan. That's just the delta. So that's that's pretty dramatic. So I think leadership matters. I think, what you can do to fortify the momentum is to deliver results and deepen the economic upside. make sure it's felt. And that's what we're doing every day.
Okay. So I wanted to lift a page from one of my favorite podcasts, The Ezra Klein Show, and ask if you could provide a few recommendations of books or articles that have shaped your thinking in the energy environmental space and that you'd recommend to others, or you can just tell us your favorite book if that works too.
It's interesting. I think when you dig into energy and environment, it's so important to come with a multidimensional view. I'm a student of history. I think about, Jill Lepore's sort of tome on American history, coming at this transition and thinking through, what things is it tugging on in terms of environmental injustice? How does this interact with the long-term struggle for greater labor empowerment? How does this interact with, different anxieties people have gone through in terms of the industrial age and automation of years past? I think being a student of history is a helpful entry point into this moment, a moment of great and significant change. But I don't know that I got a book to pin down. I will say, lawyers often read lawyer stuff. And my big recommendation is to read technology stuff or finance stuff. This is a multidisciplinary transition that's taking place. At Stanford, I used to teach STEM PhD students politics, philosophy, economics to broaden out the way they approach the problem. But lawyers probably should be doing the other side of that coin.
Definitely. I agree with that. Well, I just want to say thank you again for taking the time to chat with us today. I know that you've given many, many years of your life, both in terms of actual time and then years shaved off the back end to public service. And so I'm really grateful for that.
And let me do just one plug, Patrick. Since in DC there's no pro bono requirement, let me just do a plug for it. I mean, we are on the receiving end of people who've received pro bono services on the corporate side, on the advocacy side, et cetera. That makes such a massive difference. And it's so essential at this moment of change for our society that lawyers are doing their part in leveling the playing field, both to fight off the negative impacts of climate change, but also to help people step into the solutions. So I think, even if you're locked to a desk at a law firm, you've got a really powerful skill set that you can apply. And I hope folks do that.
Of course. Well, you all heard the challenge, so get out there and do it. Thank you again, and best of luck, and stay busy, although I'm sure you won't have a problem.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This episode of Brief Encounters was brought to you in part by our sponsors, USI Affinity, LawPay, and MyCase. Learn more in the description below.